The airfield was alive with a mixture of diesel fumes, heated metal, and a faint tang of oil and sweat that clung to the hangar walls. Morning fog hung low over the grass, curling around the landing strips and softened the edges of the aircraft lined up in meticulous rows. Engines rumbled in preparation for the day's sorties, their throaty vibrations sending tremors through the boots of mechanics and pilots alike. Among the cadets, there was a constant hum of anticipation, an unspoken competition measured in the speed of takeoff, the accuracy of maneuvers, and the daring shown during simulated dogfights. Yet in the corner of the training field, away from the laughter and boasting, one young pilot moved deliberately, checking knots in his parachute lines, inspecting the seams of his survival kit, and unfolding maps with an intensity that drew occasional glances of mild amusement. While others practiced loops and barrel rolls, he traced routes across forested ridges and small villages, noting where water sources might be found, where roads narrowed, and which areas offered concealment. Every fold of the map, every calculated line, was a rehearsal for a world that most of his peers refused to imagine. His instructors, a mix of battle-hardened veterans and meticulous theorists, watched him with a quiet respect that went largely unnoticed by the other pilots. They saw the precision in his movements, the discipline that framed even the simplest actions, checking the integrity of a compass, assessing which plants were edible, or testing the mechanics of his small, portable stove. To them, this preparation was an insurance policy against the unpredictable brutality of combat, a way to preserve life beyond the cockpit. Among his peers, however, such focus was met with derision. In the mess hall and along the perimeter of the airfield, conversations were filled with mockery, a quiet but persistent skepticism. Why bother memorizing edible roots when you got a full ration pack? One would ask with a smirk. Another would shake his head, amusement lighting his eyes, commenting on the hours spent studying maps rather than learning new formations. The young pilot listened politely but never flinched. There was no need to explain why he cared, no urgency to defend the countless drills and simulations that had become second nature. In his mind, he was already walking the paths his plane might one day force him to tread. The planes themselves were a constant reminder of fragility beneath power. The airframe of a Spitfire, though sleek and capable of reaching astonishing speeds, held a quiet vulnerability in its thin metal skin. Each rivet, each seam, was a potential failure in the heat of battle. Engines could falter, cannons could jam, and even the most skilled pilot could find himself descending in an uncontrolled spin, far from the safety of the squadron. While others reveled in the adrenaline of maneuvers and dogfights, he focused on what happened if everything went wrong. He practiced emergency landings on uneven fields, considered wind patterns across unknown terrain, and imagined how to traverse forests and streams without leaving traces. He carried a small knife not just for utility, but as a constant reminder of the need to adapt, to survive when the machines that carried him so effortlessly could no longer be trusted. Even the weather became a tool of education. Foggy mornings were lessons in orientation and patience, teaching him how to read subtle changes in the landscape when visibility was near zero. Rain-soaked days offered insight into footing, how to cross marshes and avoid hidden currents, and how moisture affected both equipment and morale. Nights under the stars provided a canvas for celestial navigation, a skill that bridged ancient practice with modern necessity. While others slept, confident in their ability to outrun any enemy or evade flak through sheer speed, he kept watch on the horizon, mentally calculating the shortest and safest paths, the areas that offered refuge, the small signs in the terrain that could guide him when all else failed. There was a rhythm to his days that outsiders often misread. While his peers measured progress in the excitement of maneuvers and the applause of instructors during simulated attacks, he measured success in knowledge internalized and skills made instinctive. A knot tied flawlessly under the low light of dawn was a victory. Understanding which trees might conceal him from observation without giving away his presence was another. Each calculated action reinforced a quiet confidence, one born not of bravado or public display, but meticulous preparation and unflinching discipline. Occasionally, he would overhear snippets of conversation from the others, comments layered with skepticism. "You'll never need that behind enemy lines," someone would say. "Better spend that time in the air than in the mud." The words would have stung in another context, but he treated them with the same dispassionate attention he gave to his maps and equipment. He understood the world differently, measured risk differently, and accepted that the distance between theory and reality was often cruelly short. In the moments when the wind shifted across the runway or the scent of diesel mingled with wet earth, he felt a quiet anticipation, not excitement, but awareness. It was a premonition of a test no one else seemed willing to face, a trial that would eventually validate every hour spent alone with his maps, tools, and careful calculations. This attention to survival, to preparation, did not make him aloof. He engaged with his peers when needed, assisted in minor repairs, shared rations when others ran short, and participated in formation drills with a competence that earned him nods of respect, even if not full approval. He moved in the world of the squadron as both insider and outsider, fully capable of performing expected duties, while quietly preparing for circumstances that others dismissed. That dual existence required a discipline far beyond physical skill. It demanded patience, observation, and the ability to imagine the worst without succumbing to fear. Even as the sun rose higher, scattering the morning fog and warming the steel of the airfield, he continued his work, checking, adjusting, and rehearsing in quiet, deliberate motions. The engines roared to life around him, filling the hangar with vibration and noise. Yet he remained focused, a man entirely present in a world that many saw only in fragments of speed, thrill, and bravado. His preparation was invisible to most, yet it was absolute, an unspoken promise to himself that if the sky betrayed him, he would not be helpless, and if the ground became hostile, he would endure. By the time the squadron was called to formation, he folded his maps, packed his kit, and climbed into his cockpit with the same calm resolve that had defined his morning. The others ascended with cheers, with confident laughter, with a belief that skill in flight alone would protect them. He ascended with a quiet knowledge of contingency, a mental checklist of every survival scenario he had rehearsed, every method of concealment, every step across the range that could mean the difference between life and death. Among the roar of engines and the chatter of pilots, he carried a solitude that was purposeful, not lonely, a preparation rooted in reality rather than reputation. In the early years of the war, amid the chaos of expanding conflict and the constant churn of young men eager to prove themselves in the air, he was a figure apart, a pilot whose greatest battles were imagined long before they were imposed, whose most critical victories were measured not in aerial duels, but in the quiet mastery of preparation. While others sought to conquer the sky through speed and daring, he sought to master what lay beneath it. In the shadows of forests, the curves of rivers, and the uncertainty of enemy territory. And in that careful, disciplined separation, he planted the seeds of survival that would one day define him in ways no mockery or laughter could diminish. The morning had begun with a deceptive calm. The sun had just begun to cast its pale light over the rolling countryside, painting the hedgerows and farmland in muted gold and green. The squadron gathered on the tarmac, engines humming like a restless swarm, each pilot methodically checking instruments and controls, unaware of how quickly routine could dissolve into chaos. The young pilot climbed into his cockpit with the same meticulous care he had applied during training, securing straps, confirming switches, and reviewing maps with the precision of someone who had already imagined every conceivable contingency. Today's mission was reconnaissance, meant to trace enemy troop movements along a stretch of territory deemed low risk. Intelligence reports suggested scattered defenses and little resistance, a predictable sweep to gather confirmation of what was already known. The squadron lifted together, a disciplined formation gliding into the soft dawn. The air vibrated with the promise of precision and control. At first, the flight was uneventful. The landscape below unfolded like a patchwork quilt, fields intersected by narrow lanes, farmhouses dotting the terrain, and woodlands stretching in dark, textured patterns. From altitude, the enemy positions appeared sparse, scattered anti-aircraft emplacements detectable only as tiny, geometric shapes nestled near roadways and village outskirts. Confidence settled over the formation. The pilots communicated in clipped, efficient bursts, confident that their presence alone would suffice to complete the reconnaissance and return without incident. Yet beneath this confidence, the young pilot's eyes scanned constantly, noting variations in vegetation, subtle smoke plumes, and glints of metal that betrayed the hidden sophistication of the defenses below, what others treated as minor details. He recorded with a quiet urgency that would prove essential. Without warning, the illusion of calm shattered. The first flak burst erupted like a brutal punctuation across the sky, black smoke and burning fragments scattering upward, shattering the morning serenity. The pilots instinctively broke formation, rolling and banking as tracer rounds and high-explosive shells tore through the air, some narrowly missing wings and fuselage. The sound was deafening, a sharp metallic cracking that made the cockpit rattle with each near impact, punctuated by the mechanical whine of engines force of maximum output. The young pilot gripped his controls, heart hammering, muscles tense in response to the sudden, violent disorder. The disciplined, methodical world of flight had dissolved into chaos, and the fragile certainty of air superiority revealed itself to be just that, fragile. As the squadron struggled to regroup, his aircraft shuddered violently under a direct hit. The engine spluttered, alarms blared, and the canopy shook with each impact. Control surfaces responded sluggishly, and the once reliable machine that had carried him safely through countless drills now betrayed him. Smoke curled into the cockpit, acrid and choking, and instruments flickered erratically, forcing him to rely on instinct as much as training. The theoretical scenarios he had rehearsed in quiet hours on the airfield, the emergency descent, controlled landing, navigation through hostile terrain, no longer existed as abstract exercises. They were now immediate imperatives, demanding action with no margin for error. Below, the countryside assumed a different character. What seemed open and familiar from a high altitude now appeared forbidding, a labyrinth of hedgerows, small forests, and villages bristling with potential threats. Each valley could conceal patrols. Each stream could betray movement with reflective glints. The young pilot's mind shifted into a precise calculation of terrain and opportunity, the knowledge once ridiculed by peers guiding every adjustment of throttle, rudder, and aileron. The plane descended in a controlled spiral, fighting the damage that made even the simplest maneuvers unpredictable. Adrenaline surged, but beneath it was a calm he had cultivated through hours of solitary preparation, a quiet, deliberate focus on survival above all else. Anti-aircraft fire continued to rain down, the explosion shaking the air around him and scattering birds from hedgerows. The squadron, disorganized and taking losses, peeled away in different directions, leaving him effectively alone, isolated in the sky above a hostile land. The sensation of solitude was immediate and profound. No radio chatter offered reassurance. No wingman's shadow mirrored his movements. The young pilot was confronted with the stark reality that, despite all training and camaraderie, survival would fall entirely on his own knowledge, decisions, and endurance. Every judgment mattered. When to bank sharply to avoid a burst, when to maintain altitude to preserve control, how to gauge wind and terrain while his instruments flickered. The descent continued, slow and deliberate, each meter closer to the ground amplifying uncertainty. Forested patches promised concealment, but risked collision with trees or uneven terrain. Open fields offered fewer obstructions but left him exposed to detection and enemy patrols. He calculated vectors, considered wind resistance, and adjusted flaps to compensate for engine sputters, all the while monitoring the small instruments that still functioned, using tactile feedback as much as sight. Smoke stains on the windshield blurred the horizon, and occasional sparks from damaged panels reminded him that a single misstep could end the attempt entirely. Time stretched and contracted unpredictably. Seconds felt like minutes as the plane bucked and trembled under stress. Yet the descent demanded immediate responses. The young pilot drew upon exercises memorized in hours of isolated training. How to read the terrain quickly. How to identify landmarks that might guide movement once on the ground. How to calculate distance and pace under duress. Each decision carried tangible consequences. Each adjustment bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and the raw reality of survival. The engine's groan and intermittent sputter were constant companions, forcing him to balance risk and caution with the pressing need to reach a safe landing zone. Finally, a narrow clearing emerged, a small meadow bordered by dense woods, uneven but the best option available under the circumstances. He eased the aircraft toward the ground, using every ounce of control to manage speed and descent angle. The landing was rough. The landing gear sank into soft soil, jarring the cockpit violently, but it held. The plane skidded, gouging earth and grass, leaving a trail of torn vegetation and scorched metal. When it came to a halt, the young pilot's body was shaking, but the aircraft had survived, and with it, the fragile hope of life. He climbed from the cockpit, surveying the surrounding landscape with a practiced eye, noting where concealment could be maintained and how to navigate towards safer territory. As he stood among the torn grass and residual smoke of his forced landing, the full weight of the moment settled. The abstract survival skills he had spent months honing were no longer theoretical exercises. They were immediately essential. Each piece of equipment, every route memorized in study sessions, every calculated action became a lifeline. The enemy was present, and the land around him was no longer just a map of reconnaissance targets. It was a real, living threat, filled with patrols, hidden sentries, and unpredictable challenges. He drew in a long breath, steadying himself, and moved into the woods, aware that the path ahead would demand every ounce of patience, knowledge, and discipline he had cultivated in quiet hours on distant airfields. In the space of a single mission, the young pilot had shifted from participant in routine operations to solitary survivor. The morning's calm, the airfield structure routines, and the measured confidence of training had dissolved into a raw confrontation with the unpredictable realities of war. Every choice from this point forward would be grounded not in skill in the cockpit alone, but in an intimate understanding of terrain, timing, and human limitation. The world had transformed beneath him, and he alone carried the tools to navigate it. What had been theoretical, mocked, and overlooked by peers was now the very difference between life and death, a test that demanded both courage and quiet mastery. The forest edge greeted him with a cold, damp silence, the morning light filtering through the canopy in narrow shafts that barely touched the leaf-littered floor. The plain behind him had been reduced to a twisted silhouette in the meadow, its engine cold and inert, a stark reminder that the air above no longer offered safety. Each breath carried the scent of wet earth and pine resin, sharp and penetrating, mingling with the acrid smoke still clinging to the fuselage. He moved cautiously, his boots sinking into soft soil, each step deliberate, measured, leaving as few traces as possible. The weight of the survival kit on his back pressed into his shoulders, a tangible anchor preparation, but also a constant reminder that he could not rely on chance. The landscape, once a distant map studied in calm hours, was now a living, breathing adversary, its forests concealing patrols, its fields exposing him, and every river or ravine a potential barrier to movement. Hunger gnawed at him, subtle at first, then insistent, a persistent reminder of the human body's vulnerability in prolonged stress. The emergency rations packed with precision were insufficient for more than a day, and the streams he encountered carried the uncertainty of contamination. He recalled the lessons he had once laughed at, how to filter water through charcoal, how to recognize edible roots and berries, how to move silently over uneven terrain. Each decision required careful calculation. The risk of straying from cover to reach water versus the danger of leaving a scent trail or visible disturbance that might betray his presence to enemy patrols. The forest was alive with sound. Distant artillery booms, the rustle of leaves under small animals, and occasionally the sharp crack of a branch betraying the passage of men moving in ways he could not immediately detect. Each noise was a test of focus, forcing him to distinguish between harmless signals and potential threats, and to remain calm even when instincts screamed for haste. The first night behind enemy lines was the most difficult. He crouched beneath a thick overhang of branches, the cold seeping into his bones, sleep constantly interrupted by the imagined or real creak of distant movement. His training had emphasized the importance of mental discipline, and he forced his mind into a rigid schedule. Rest in short bursts, maintain situational awareness, rehearse escape routes, and conserve energy. The forest, which during the day had been a maze of visual cues, at night became an opaque expanse, shapes blending into shadows, sounds amplified and distorted. Hunger and fatigue created a gnawing tension in his stomach and muscles, yet he reminded himself that the greatest danger came not from weakness alone, but from panic and inattention. Each hour passed slowly, the darkness pressing in, and with it the knowledge that a single misstep, noise, flash of movement, or poor choice of cover could end everything. Over the following days, movement became a careful dance between necessity and stealth. He studied patrol routes observed from concealed positions, timing his crossings to coincide with moments of distraction or absence. The knowledge he had once rehearsed in isolation guided each choice: how to step lightly across twigs, how to position his body to avoid silhouette against the sky, how to read subtle cues in wind direction and soil disturbance that betrayed human presence. Fields were crossed in brief, calculated bursts, hedgerows used as temporary shields, and villages skirted at a distance where he could gather visual information without revealing himself. Even the simplest gestures, lifting a pack to clear a branch, adjusting a jacket to blend with shadow, became acts of survival, executed with the precision of someone who understood that small errors compounded rapidly in a hostile environment. Fatigue was relentless. Muscles ached from constant tension, joints stiffened from repeated crouching, and blisters formed on feet that had rarely endured so much extended exertion over uneven terrain. Hunger, while partially managed by foraging and careful rationing, remained a persistent gnawing, sapping strength and focus. He discovered, however, that the mind could compensate for the body, and each challenge became an opportunity to test the training that had been dismissed as unnecessary. Observation sharpened, patience deepened, a profound awareness of time, space, and distance emerged. He learned to move as part of the terrain, to become a shadow within shadows, to anticipate risk before it became immediate. The forest, once alien and imposing, gradually became a partner in survival, offering concealment resources and orientation cues to the disciplined observer. Despite the isolation, he maintained a mental rhythm designed to prevent despair. Each day was structured into movement, observation, rationing, and rest. He cataloged landmarks, noted subtle changes in terrain, and continuously rehearsed potential escape or evasion strategies. The knowledge that patrols could appear at any moment required constant vigilance. The snap of a branch, a glint of metal, or an unusual pattern in the underbrush might signal immediate danger. The forest demanded a heightened sense of awareness, a quiet tension that could not be abandoned, and he moved through it with both caution and determination, relying on instinct honed by months of preparation. The landscape was not uniform. Farmland presented entirely different challenges than dense woodland. Open fields risked exposure, yet offered speed, while villages demanded negotiation between visibility and the potential for supplies. Streams and marshes slowed progress, but could mask movement if crossed carefully. Every terrain type required adaptation, a conscious recalibration of pace, posture, and awareness. The young pilot moved deliberately, often circling obstacles or taking indirect routes to preserve cover and minimize signs of passage. His understanding of terrain and human psychology became as essential as physical endurance. He calculated the probable positions of enemy patrols based on roads, footpaths, and strategic points, moving in a pattern designed to maximize distance while minimizing risk of detection. As days passed, hunger, fatigue, and isolation tested not only his physical stamina, but also his mental resilience. Memories of ridicule from peers, once a source of quiet irritation, now took on a different dimension. The very skills once dismissed, how to navigate, how to forage, how to conceal presence, how to endure stress, were sustaining him, each lesson internalized now proving essential. Survival became an active, intellectual exercise, a continuous chain of decisions where hesitation could be fatal. By measuring risk, conserving energy, and applying training with precision, he converted what had been mockery into the source of his continued existence. Movement became less about speed and more about calculation, patience, and the careful reading of terrain. Each step through the woods or across a hedgerow was informed by a matrix of knowledge, wind, visibility, potential observation points, and his own endurance. Nights were spent in shallow depressions, under the cover of low branches, or beside streams, where the reflection of moonlight could betray position. He learned to sleep in short cycles, waking frequently to check for danger, to monitor wind shifts, or to listen for distant voices. The environment, harsh and indifferent, demanded constant adaptation, and with each successful maneuver, the young pilot's confidence deepened, reinforced by the tangible proof of his own survival. By the end of the first week, the pilot had traversed miles of hostile land, navigating forests, streams, and fields with careful efficiency. Hunger persisted, fatigue lingered, and danger was never absent. Yet he had begun to move with rhythm, an instinctive understanding of timing, terrain, and personal limits. What had once been abstract preparation had become the foundation of life, transforming a man once mocked for prudence into a disciplined, capable survivor. Each step toward friendly lines was informed by observation, calculation, and self-discipline, a slow, deliberate progression that underscored the quiet truth of his training. Survival was less a matter of luck than a preparation, patience, and the willingness to endure when all else had failed. The forest closed in as he paused to survey the horizon. Morning mist curled among the trees, masking the ground and softening the light. Each movement had been deliberate, each choice calculated, and yet the weight of isolation pressed upon him. Even so, he remained focused, aware that every careful step through enemy territory validated the lessons once ridiculed. Survival had become a disciplined art, a continuum of observation, patience, and application, and the world around him, though hostile, was now navigable through knowledge, not chance. The path to safety was uncertain, but the skills he had honed with quiet dedication had transformed a mock preparation into a living, breathing reality that carried him forward, step by measured step, through the perilous expanse of enemy territory. The forest thinned gradually as he moved, the dense canopy giving way to scattered fields and the distant shapes of villages, their rooftops peeking cautiously through early morning mist. Each step forward carried the dual weight of relief and vigilance. The war around him had not waited. Front lines had shifted, towns once behind enemy lines now marked by destruction, and the steady churn of occupation and resistance had redrawn the map he had studied in safer days. He paused at the edge of a small road, observing from cover as a pair of soldiers passed, their uniforms unfamiliar in subtle details. Friend or foe? The question lingered sharply. His instincts, honed through weeks of solitary navigation, dictated patience. He waited, breathing lightly, listening for cadence, the jingle of gear, the rhythm of boots on dirt. Only when they moved beyond visual range did he risk stepping onto open ground, moving deliberately, calculating every stride. Rivers and streams continued to punctuate the landscape, their currents varying from slow meander to rushing torrent. Crossing them required care. A misjudged step could produce noise, expose reflection, or draw attention from a hidden patrol. Each waterway was both a barrier and a resource. He drank sparingly, filtering the water through fabric and charcoal to remove silt and impurities. Fish were scarce, and foraging required judgment, relying on the same knowledge that had sustained him earlier, roots that offer nutrition, small animals that could be trapped quietly, and the keen observation of animal behavior that hinted at water and safe passage. Hunger was persistent, yet it no longer dominated his focus. Survival had shifted from reaction to strategy, from endurance to calculated persistence. The war-torn villages he skirted were landscapes of ambiguity. Smoke curled from chimneys where civilians remained, cautiously tending fires and livestock, while bombed-out buildings offered hiding places for soldiers or partisan fighters. His approach was meticulous. He avoided open streets, sticking to alleys, hedgerows, and ruined walls. When he passed near a farmhouse, he crouched low, listening for speech, watching windows, and analyzing shadows. Civilians were both potential allies and threats. A gesture, a shouted warning, or mistaken identification could reveal his position. Years of training now merged with experience, guiding him through the delicate balance of interaction and evasion. He moved as part of the landscape, becoming almost invisible, a presence observed only by the earth, the wind, and the subtle traces left behind. Nights offered both opportunity and danger. He slept in shallow depressions or beneath low branches, choosing locations that would mask movement and sound. The cool air carried distant gunfire and artillery, reminders that the war was ongoing, fluid, and indifferent. His sleep was punctuated by mental rehearsals, routes, landmarks, and potential threats. Even in darkness, he maintained awareness of wind direction, ambient sounds, and the faintest signs of movement. Stars provided navigation, their constellations reliable when maps and compasses were impractical. The discipline of mental routine kept panic at bay. Each day survive reaffirmed both skill and determination. As he progressed, subtle signs of organized resistance began to emerge. Posters, discarded ammunition, and hidden caches suggested the presence of networks working quietly to undermine enemy occupation. He approached these areas with caution, aware that while allies might exist, the wrong step could compromise both himself and those who had risked exposure to maintain a covert presence. Observation from concealment allowed him to map patrol patterns, assess safety, and plan crossings without engaging. His survival depended on discretion, patience, and the quiet application of skills cultivated long before the immediate need arose. The terrain shifted yet again, from fields to woodland edges, and then into larger expanses of open countryside. From this vantage, he could see the distant outline of Allied positions, tents, vehicles, and small groups of soldiers moving with coordinated purpose. Recognition brought both relief and renewed tension. Approaching friendly forces in the midst of a dynamic battlefield required caution. Mistaken identity could lead to gunfire even from those who would ultimately become allies. He identified subtle visual signals, flags, positions of sentries, and behavior of soldiers to guide a careful approach. Every step was deliberate, slow, and controlled. Each action designed to signal harmless intent while preserving the appearance of non-threat. Finally, he emerged from the trees onto a slight rise that offered full view of an Allied encampment. The terrain between him and safety was open, yet he moved with measured confidence, aware that the skills once mocked were now his most valuable asset. Reaching the edge of the camp, he paused to signal, carefully raising a hand while keeping low. Recognition came slowly. A soldier approached, weapon lowered after a brief moment of scrutiny. Relief washed over him, yet was tempered by the discipline that had carried him through weeks of isolation. He was alive, uninjured beyond minor fatigue and hunger, and the training that others had dismissed had proved decisive. The reception among Allied soldiers was quiet but genuine. His story spread in hushed tones. The same ranks that had once dismissed meticulous survival training now acknowledging its value. Small gestures, nods, brief conversations, shared rations communicated respect and recognition. There were no grand celebrations. The war continued unabated. Yet within that acknowledgement lay profound validation. A skill set once considered superfluous had preserved life, demonstrating the unpredictable realities of conflict and the essential role of preparation, patience, and adaptability. In the following days, he assisted with intelligence briefings, providing first-hand accounts of terrain, enemy disposition, and the subtleties of survival behind lines. His observations were precise, informed by weeks of direct experience, and they shaped operational understanding for missions yet to come. His perspective was unique. It combined theoretical knowledge, practical application, and lived experience under extreme conditions. The military recognized not just the return of a pilot, but the return of insight that could save others, validating the discipline and foresight that had guided him in isolation. Even as he reintegrated, the psychological impact of solitary survival lingered. He walked differently, observed differently, and considered risk with a refined understanding that those who had remained in controlled environments could not fully appreciate. Silence, observation, and deliberate movement had become instincts, guiding him in ways that would endure far beyond this single mission. The war continued, fluid and unforgiving, yet it acquired a resilience grounded in preparation, experience, and the quiet application of knowledge that had once seemed irrelevant. The journey back had transformed him in ways subtle and profound. Mockery had become proof, skepticism replaced by acknowledgement, and preparation elevated from abstract theory to lived necessity. The landscape, once a threat, had become a canvas for skill and endurance. The pilot's return to Allied lines was not marked by spectacle, but by the sober recognition of survival achieved through patience, calculation, and the disciplined application of training. The lesson was clear. In the unpredictable sweep of war, preparation was as critical as courage, foresight as valuable as audacity, and the ability to endure, adapt, and navigate unseen dangers could determine life or death. Standing at the edge of the encampment, the pilot surveyed the horizon. Smoke from distant towns mingled with morning fog, the distant sounds of artillery and movement a reminder that the conflict was ongoing. Yet within that horizon, he could recognize a profound truth. The knowledge once ridiculed had carried him across enemy lines, through danger and isolation, and ultimately back to the ranks of allies. It was a testament not only to skill but to foresight, perseverance, and the quiet mastery of preparation. In the unpredictable calculus of war, he had emerged intact, transformed, and validated, a living proof of the enduring value of discipline, observation, and the often overlooked art of survival.